When you hear the words video games, you probably don't think about the 1970s. We all know intellectually that it was an important period of time for games. It was the introduction of video game consoles like the Magnavox Odyssey, the Microvision, or the Atari 2600. Famous games were released like Asteroids, Breakout, Pong, Space Invaders, Zork. The foundation of modern gaming was set during this decade, but you still probably don't think about the 1970s when I mention video games. Similarly, when I mention Sierra, perhaps you think of the Sierra Trading Post, a popular outdoors recreation store. Maybe you think of the GMC Sierra or the Sierra Nevadas. However, it's also unlikely that when I mention Sierra, you think immediately of Sierra Online. However, for almost 30 years, Sierra Online was at times the largest, most profitable, or most influential gaming company in the world. The founders of which were responsible for making or breaking entire careers and setting the direction of the entire industry. And their contributions, decisions, and mistakes are still affecting the industry even today. In 1979, Roberta Williams was playing Colossal Cave Adventure. This was the first interactive fiction or text adventure game. In fact, it was the first adventure game, period. You might have heard the game mentioned in our Gearbox video as a young Randy Pitchford would decompile Colossal Cave to learn how to code. Similarly, Roberta would play through Colossal Cave Adventure and come away with a desire to produce her own stories. However, she was adamant that her stories required a graphical component. Ken Williams, her husband, was a mainframe programmer with experience on IBMs, and he'd been working on a Fortran compiler, a way of reading code and telling a processor what to do. Roberta came to Ken with a game idea, a game called Mystery House, or that's what it would come to be called. In a moment of true marital support, Ken scrapped the compiler and shifted all work over to producing Roberta's game, the first graphical adventure game. Mystery House was a success, a stellar success, netting the Williams almost 4 times their annual salary in the first 6 months. Mystery House was only sold from 4 physical locations in Los Angeles and a small magazine named Micro Magazine, and yet within a year, the Williams would move their company to Coarse Gold, California, at the base of the Sierra Mountains and Sierra National Forest outside Yosemite National Park. Taking inspiration from their surroundings, they would change their company name from Online Systems to Sierra Online, and additionally adopt the Yosemite Half Dome as their logo. Officially, Sierra was now in business. There is a historical precedence to stories about Sierra. In a lot of ways, these stories must tell 3 chapters, and you've just heard the first one. Sometimes that same first chapter is intertwined with the democratization of the computer, the mainframe that became the microcomputer, which in turn led to the personal computer, the Macintosh, the modern technological leap forward. There is a mythological aspect to Sierra and the timing and influence they had, especially on the burgeoning home computer industry. There's often conversation around the groundbreaking addition of graphics and how Sierra would engage in a battle of the giants against Infocom and their text-only adventures like Zork. The story follows a rise and fall dynamic, how Sierra saw that the end user, the gamer, would slip into the immersive graphics of a game more easily than the novelization of it. How many gamers would rage against them for their dumbing down of the interactive story and blame Sierra for poisoning the purity of the medium. How they would lift up and create the adventure game model, and then as those adventure games were replaced, so too would they be. For this very reason, this story always starts with Colossal Cave Adventure. By cementing their moment of creation to inspiration directly from the very first adventure game, Sierra is able to romanticize their creation myth. They hold the torch. They are true followers, and therefore their iteration of adventure games are most pure. Yet, as with many origin stories, it is a myth. It's not a particularly harmful one. There wasn't a cult or dark dealings with nefarious characters in alleyways, or at least not too many of them. Instead, the story is ordinary, banal, and significantly less sacred. In the early years, before the realization that Colossal Cave Adventure would be so immortalized by history, and before Sierra was worried about their legacy or even at the peak of their growth, the Williams gave an interview. Stephen Levy, the journalist who leaked the iPod, who coined the hacker ethic, and who found Albert Einstein's brain in a jar and revealed it to the world, wrote a book called Hackers: Heroes of the Computer Revolution. This book has been instrumental in saving the history of these early programmers, and one section is called Game Hackers. In this piece from 1984, we get a different look at the period of time which led to the creation of Sierra. In it, Roberta is quoted as having played every single adventure game available at the time, including their eventual ideological nemesis, Zork. Roberta played them for months, years maybe, on the teletype Model 33 that Ken had brought home to work on his side projects, such as the Fortran compiler. This is a pretty hefty piece of equipment, essentially a typewriter that would print out the responses on paper, and Ken being immersed in that field, it's not surprising he would show off the entertainment purposes of this very loud motorized piece of equipment he'd installed into his and Roberta's living space. By her own account, Roberta was not interested in computers, and so it seems completely believable that Ken would attempt to warm her up to this invasion of their personal privacy. No marriage enjoys having a partner who not only brings home his work, but literally installs it in the house on a semi-permanent basis. There is no special mention of Colossal Cave because at the time, it wasn't even known to have been the first adventure game. It had no special significance either to Williams or to the general population, and only later, through academic elevation, was it added to any pedestal. Further, rather than any sort of eureka moment, it seems that Roberta approached Ken about her game multiple times, and if anything, Ken seems to have been somewhat dismissive about this passion of hers. Roberta is somewhat famous and remains so throughout her career for a less than traditional method of creating games. She would draw the art and connect locations in a visual way without any real coding basis. Instead, more like you might structure a television show or a movie. Very visual. Ken told Roberta that her little stack of papers was very nice and she should run along and finish it. Not long after, Ken and Roberta were at the Plank House in the Valley, a redwood-walled steakhouse where they often dined, and there he finally listened to his delicate wife describing how her game put you in an old Victorian house in which your friends were being killed off one by one. Specifically, about this reveal of the game which he'd finally paid attention to, Ken says, "She was talking about the plot to the game and the murder and everything else, and she tends to get real passionate about things, and people at other tables are trying to figure out what she's talking about if she's describing a series of murders." As it continues, it seems to be somewhat clear this was a man indulging his wife in an endeavor he barely believed in and certainly didn't expect to be profitable. In fact, it wasn't until Ken brought home an Apple II that he'd agreed to even work on the game, and it's probable this was more of an exercise for his eventual Apple II computer graphics book, a how-to of techniques for designing graphics on the machine. They even approached Programma, a publisher, and only walked away when they were offered 25% royalties. Instead, they published themselves. And it was profitable, but not without effort. Instead of 4 small stores suddenly being deluged by avid game enthusiasts throwing money at the cashiers, Ken himself was often present, giving demos and securing sales. Additionally, that small magazine was in fact Micro, an enthusiast magazine geared towards Apple II hobbyists, and the small ad was a full page. Ken would even continue to go to his daily job as a programmer for the first couple of months, as Roberta would be home packaging 5 1/4 floppy disks into Ziploc bags and mailing them out. But again, it was very profitable. They made $10,000 the first month, $20,000 the second month, $30,000 the third month, and at this point they did in fact decide to move to the base of the Sierras and set up as a software company. However, Ken would never truly accept Sierra's role as the point man for adventure games, and this is shown repeatedly through his actions throughout the entire history of Sierra, but even more so in the beginning. In every major ad for Mystery House, or High-Res Adventure Number 1 as it was called at the time, the game would be one of several on offer, and it was usually further down in the list, never in an overtly prominent position. Ken would continue for his entire career to promote non-gaming products, or at least non-adventure games. From football and cribbage to the Superscript text processor, and eventually the Homeward Plus word processor, a notable and expensive failure, Ken worked very hard not to be a gaming company. He was quoted once as saying that he feared that online systems would eventually become known only as an adventure programming house. And it's an irony that today we ignore how hard Sierra worked to diversify away from adventure games. Over the next decade and a half, Sierra would release a lot of titles: King's Quest, Space Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Ultima, the Gabriel Knight series, the Inca series, You Don't Know Jack, Phantasmagoria, and dozens more. In 1996, they would sell themselves to CompuCard, or CUC, along with another gaming company called Davidson & Associates for $1.5 billion and $1.6 billion respectively, in a bid to allow CUC to streamline their distribution. At this point, Sierra becomes a property of someone else, but they are a very big fish in that pond, representing over 16% of all gaming software, putting them in the same categories as Microsoft and the likes. In fact, Microsoft was number 3 at the time with just over 10% of the market. Ken Williams spent his time wooing potential partners, including one former Microsoft executive who was working on their first new game, Valve, and Sierra would eventually be the publisher for Half-Life. However, as a property, Sierra would be moved around a lot. CUC would merge with HFS, Hospitality Franchise Systems, the owners of Days Inn, Avis Rent-A-Car, and Jackson Hewitt, to become the Cendant Corporation. A few months later, Cendant would be under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraudulent accounting and would be forced to sell off Cendant Software, which was comprised of Sierra, Davidson & Associates, and some other smaller companies they'd also owned, to a company called Avas, a French media conglomerate. Things started to look grim for Sierra here, and they were forced to begin cutting workers, closing studios, canceling games, and otherwise consolidating their business. They stopped producing games and became almost exclusively a publisher of smaller titles. They published Homeworld, Star Siege, Team Fortress Classic, Ground Control, and a few others. A few months after that, Avas would engage in a strategic business alliance with Seagram, the owners of Universal, and Canal Plus, a French media company, to become Vivendi Universal. Avas was renamed Vivendi Publishing, and the software arm would become Vivendi Games. Davidson & Associates was closed except for one studio, Blizzard Entertainment. Additionally, Sierra would drop the online part of their name and become Sierra Entertainment. And they continued to publish games such as No One Lives Forever through Vivendi's newest purchase of Fox Interactive, Homeworld 2, the Spyro series, Crash Bandicoot, and others. Of course, that didn't last for long. Vivendi, in retrospect, was bad for basically every game studio they worked with, and Sierra was no different. They closed down the last of Sierra's studios, they eliminated hundreds of jobs at Sierra's various locations, they shut down many of Sierra's offices, and on August 24th, 2004, Vivendi disestablished Sierra as a company, relegating them to nothing more than a division of Vivendi Games. Like some sort of macabre mask, Vivendi stopped using their own name and started exclusively publishing under the Sierra name, but Sierra was well and truly dead. In 2008, Vivendi Games merged Blizzard with Activision to create Activision Blizzard and transferred all ownership of Sierra products to Activision. Later, Activision would buy itself from Vivendi and become the Activision Blizzard media company we know today. They sold off most of the properties properties that Sierra owned, and in 2018, they sold Sierra.com to TJX for the Sierra Trading Post retail store. And that's it. Sierra is no more. Activision owns the label and brand name, but the company doesn't exist. And really, it stopped existing back in 1996 when it was sold to CUC. Ken and Roberta are multimillionaires who travel the world on a yacht, and the legacy of Sierra is now more about the connection, the origin story, the mythology of having created the graphical story-based game, of having moved gaming from either blind action or immersive story into a peanut butter and chocolate level of compromise with both. The mental imaginings of a titan battle between the forward-thinking Williams versus the closed-mindedness of the Infocom text-based warriors. The rise and fall story of a gaming company that lived and breathed adventure, so closely aligned with their fates that when adventure games stopped selling well, they disappeared and crumbled into the dust. Obviously, as with any company, it's certainly more nuanced than that. It's easier to compress 30 years into a short and pithy story than it is to attempt to take things apart. There's a really fantastic article, a dissertation actually, regarding the year surrounding the creation of Mystery House, written by Dr. Lane Nooney, an assistant professor of media and information industries in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University's Game Center in the Tisch School of Arts, and that's one incredible title, so you know her work is exciting. I've linked it below. If you enjoyed this video, please share it on Reddit because it really helps us grow and reach a new audience, but feel free not to. You can watch another video in the corner right now, and as always, we'll see you on the next one.